So not too long ago, I noticed an article that Ryan Heath put out about looking at coverage and schematic matchups in fantasy. And so I just wanted to go through it a little bit and also like kind of give some of my thoughts on this whole idea of looking at, schematic tendencies of defensive coverage and how that impacts the ceiling or upside of our receivers on a weekly basis. All right, so this is the article that Ryan Heath put out. He did a lot of work. He's a very good analyst. You should go check him out and follow him on Twitter. One of my favorite follows. He puts out insightful things pretty regularly, and it's stuff that you normally wouldn't really even think about, or stuff that you've never seen before generally. Because he has access to this data from fantasy points that where they have their play charters, it allows them to kind of delve into topics and different research areas that normally haven't really gone researched, right? Like we haven't we haven't really had any sort of research on defensive coverages and how it impacts their ceiling or receiver ceiling on a week to week basis. I've always kind of just hand waved the idea that you could predict or find uh, receivers with a higher ceiling or have a better matchup. The generic fantasy analysis has been that you should just kind of play the players that are facing up against the defenses that have allowed the most fantasy points to that position. I'm extremely skeptical that that's actually effective and actually providing an edge. Maybe in some extreme cases where defenses have like a ton of injuries at the defensive back position, or maybe, there's a huge offensive line, defensive line mismatch. I think in the extremes, yes, it's kind of helpful, but for the most part, it's kind of hard to actually use what we've known as matchup analysis. It's been hard to trust that matchup analysis in the past has actually yielded better results than had you just completely ignored it. But there's some insightful stuff here. He really just looks at different coverages, and so we could pull up this tweet here actually. So he looked at the correlation between fantasy points and the specific metric versus, whatever the coverage split is. And so, like, from what I understand, he's like looking at, okay, at a minimum, they've had to have at least played 5 games so far, or we're week 5 and onward. And he's looking at like only games where they ran 20 or more routes, which is reasonable. And so, from what I'm piecing together, is he's just like, let's say we're in week 8. He's looking at their ability, their target share against man coverage, for example. He's looking at that over the first 8 weeks of the season. And then he's just slicing and dicing it like that, and then seeing how it predicts their fantasy points in whatever the following week is. That's kind of how I understood it. I'm pretty sure that's what he's doing. So you have varying degrees of sample size on, what a stat is including of their past history. So your targets per out run versus zone coverage, let's say for Devontae Adams, I'm assuming that it's like, okay, his targets per out run versus zone coverage for the first 5 weeks, and then his target per outs run versus zone coverage for the first 6 weeks. Then it's the 7 weeks, then 8 weeks, then 9, and then that's just to predict the following week. So like for the first 6 weeks, Devontae Adams yards per out run versus zone, how predictive is that of week 9 performance? That's kind of how I get, and he just did that a bunch of times to and calculated out the correlations. So yeah, it's interesting. This is just a flat prediction of their kind of how they will perform from a fantasy points perspective in that next week. It might be interesting to see the correlation of their metrics up to that point with fantasy points the rest of the season. That might be interesting to do, but that's not necessarily what he's looking for. He's looking for weekly upside. And so this is kind of just to get a general sense of which stats are most predictive of fantasy points in the next week. And that's kind of how you could just think about it there. There's it's kind of hard to glean any value from this. Like generally, your performance versus single high is more predictive of future production. Performance versus man, it doesn't seem to carry as much predictive value than performance versus zone, which makes sense because I think on small sample size, like your your performance versus man is probably going to be have a wider degree of variance. So for instance, if you're like running a go ball versus man and you win that, you're gonna have a lot of yards on that play, and maybe it bolsters up that player's yards per out run in that given instance. Whereas zone, you have less likely to have like these wide swing outcomes. And this is evidenced in this PFF article where they show it here. This is the distribution of expected points added versus man and zone. And you see that against man coverage, there's a wider tail of outcomes, right? And so the kind of if you have a small sample size of man attempts, there's going to be a wider range of performance, higher variance than against zone. And so I think that's what's showing up here is that you just have a wider range of variance. And so like that last 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks of a sample size is less reliable than that of against zone because zone is more, there's less variance. And so that's kind of interesting to see. I guess the real takeaway of all of this is that he basically found that certain coverage splits give you access to higher ceiling for receivers. And the implications of this are kind of huge. Like, you know, this actually kind of shows that there is some effective analysis to be had with matchups, right? But what I've always kind of been a little concerned about here is the rate of man coverage and zone coverage and, single high, two high. I don't know how stable that is from a week to week basis. Like, how can we truly expect a defense to run a certain amount of man or a certain amount of zone when it's very situation dependent, right? Like, if we go back to this PFF article, they show that by down, man coverage on late downs is much more frequent than it is on first and second, and then down in distance as well. So like the intermediate and shorts, you have much higher man rates than you do in, long distances. So like I don't know, like it seems very situation driven how often teams will play man or zone. So I'm pretty skeptical. Like I know in extremes there's certain teams that probably play more man or zone consistently, but and yeah, like maybe if we can just find those extreme outliers, that's useful as well. But I almost wonder if there's overlap between the like fantasy points allowed matchup analysis and when you on the extremes and this kind of stuff on the extremes. Uh, Essentially what you want to do though, like and what I get the sense is happening here is like, hey, certain coverage types with certain players are going to yield better ceiling outcomes more often. And so you effectively could make a model where you're looking at the kind of coverage where you're trying to predict what the coverage rates are on a week to week basis of a team. And then look at kind of like, okay, which receivers on this like that are facing this defense this week actually do have a higher ceiling. And then just give them like a pretty basic score. Like, okay, this is their matchup score. Like 0 to 99 and it'll give you a sense of like, okay, is this guy a better does he have a better matchup or not? With some actual data backing it up and not just like fantasy points allowed, right? So I think there's some potential for it. It definitely like mainly a DFS finding, right? Like where you're trying to set the perfect lineup, um, like with your salary. Uh, but yeah, I think this could really level up. This kind of analysis could really level up sit start decisions for redraft managers and even dynasty managers, right? Any all managed formats, if you have two similarly projected players and you can play the higher upside play um whenever you need to, like that is truly a valuable thing, right? So if it can truly help your sit start efficiency, I think this is awesome. But again, I'm very skeptical that it could do that because we've gone a long time without this kind of analysis, and I don't think that like our sit start efficiency would drastically be altered by something like this. It would only maybe improve like a couple spots where it's like, okay, we actually hit a ceiling outcome here, and we needed it. Well, obviously you want ceiling outcomes every week, but yeah, I wonder because most fantasy matchups are decided in blowout fashion, and so if you're just like able to get a higher rate of big weeks, and it truly gets you those better weeks more often than you would have otherwise. Yeah, I think this is truly helpful and useful. The problem is like the data is all paywalled. And so like this'll never really hit the, general population unless this type of data gets released. And well, maybe certain platforms, like Yahoo or ESPN or wherever, maybe they start to incorporate just like some sort of model for to measure matchups, and they have this kind of stuff under the hood, but I'm not sure if like how close we are to something like that. Might be a ways out, but yeah, ultimately it's a cool finding. I think the more actionable thing that I've been thinking about lately is that man coverage, I didn't realize this before, but man coverage is a lot stickier for defenses. And so and you also have, these man coverage rates are quite different based on the circumstances. And so I almost wonder if you have a receiver that's really good versus man, and we know is like really elite man beater, that like if you can project that the team will face more third down situations in short or intermediate distances, like I think that provides a greater ceiling inherently that like, hey, defenses are going to play a lot of man because, so and so team is in a lot of short, intermediate, and third downs. Uh, I almost wonder if playing your really good man beating receivers in those types of matchups, like if you could maybe project those kind of things, like the game level situations, then that might be sort of helpful as well. But ultimately, all this matchup stuff is very tricky. And for DFS purposes, it's like probably extremely helpful. For most fantasy purposes, like setting your lineups, it's it's not really. Like I want it to be useful. I want it to be really, really helpful, but I think fantasy really just comes down to just draft good players, play good players. This kind of matchup stuff is not really, I mean, like I said, we obviously haven't had this matchup stuff, this advanced matchup stuff for a while, and I'm not sure if something like this was introduced, if it would drastically improve your sit start decisions. Again, I'm just like really skeptical. So maybe it's not even a lane worth going down if you're not a big DFS player or like a big tournament player, right? Because cash games are like head-to-head DFS matchups. Uh, I don't think you really need to pay attention to any of this either, you know? So yeah, these are just my thoughts. Uh, Hopefully it's at least somewhat coherent and you can understand kind of where I'm coming from. But yeah, I mean, be a little weary, right? Like if you see any, I think it's best practice to always be skeptical before taking something as gospel, right? And just believing that this is going to truly help. I have always been and will continue to be that like this matchup stuff is kind of not that useful. But yeah, so like I can give an example too. Like last year, there was a week where Garrett Wilson, I had to decide between Garrett Wilson and T. Higgins, I believe. And in that week, I got the sense that T. Higgins um was the better play because I thought Garrett Wilson would get shadowed by Christian Gonzalez, right? And have a lot of man coverage. And and so but I was thinking that like Gonzalez was just gonna flat out win that battle because Gonzalez is one of the best corners in the NFL. And so Gonzalez did kind of shadow him. Garrett Wilson still had some targets, had some success. And I think both Higgins and Gonzalez wound up having similar production at the end of the game. And it wouldn't have really mattered whether or not I started either or. And so I guess the moral of the story is like, hey, even if this coverage stuff does matter, does it matter enough to influence your kind of point total at the end of the week to overcome a really massive deficit? If it doesn't, then I think we can kind of safely ignore it. But if it does actually heavily skew your potential outcome in a week, then yeah, okay, cool. I'm all in. But very skeptical about this. If you have any questions, comments, things of that nature, feel free to comment below. I'm very curious to have like a discussion about this kind of thing. Um, and I maybe I'll do the research, but I haven't really seen any research whatsoever, by the way, to suggest that like the fantasy points allowed matchup analysis actually helps. Like I've never actually seen something that's like, hey, look, this matchup analysis is truly helping you make better decisions. I've never seen that. If somebody has a link to a study like that, I'd love to read through. But yeah, continue to be a skeptic and, have fun. I guess that's my words of wisdom.